The test began on a quiet morning. At first, it seemed like any other ordinary day. People went about their routines, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. But suddenly, across the globe, the atmosphere changed. A strange signal flashed across every screen, every device, and every speaker. It was an alien transmission. The message was simple and chilling. The test has begun. Survive or face extinction. For most, it didn't make sense. Who were these aliens, and why were they targeting Earth? But there was no time to question it. The world watched in horror as strange weather patterns began to emerge. In the United States, tornadoes the size of cities tore through entire states. In Africa, massive sandstorms covered the desert, turning the land into an endless ocean of dust. The oceans themselves seemed to come alive, with towering waves that reached higher than any skyscraper, crashing against coastlines with terrifying force. At first, the humans tried to fight back. They sent out rescue teams, military forces, and scientists to try and control the disasters. But nothing worked. No one had ever seen weather like this before, and no technology seemed capable of stopping it. The aliens had designed this part of the test carefully. They didn't just want to destroy. They wanted to see how humanity would react to their world being torn apart. Would they panic? Would they lose all hope? Or would they fight? In the streets, panic spread like wildfire. People didn't know where to go, what to do. Families were torn apart as people tried to escape the chaos, only to be swallowed by the unpredictable storms. The government was no help. Entire cities went dark as power grids failed under the pressure of constant natural disasters. In the middle of all this, there was one group that refused to give up. They were just a handful of survivors, people who had been brought together by the worst of circumstances. Most of them were ordinary people, school teachers, engineers, doctors, and even a few military officers. But in this moment of disaster, they became something more. They found each other amidst the chaos and made a decision. They were not going to let these aliens decide their fate. They were going to fight back. The first challenge was brutal. The aliens had released a series of catastrophic events across the globe, each one more destructive than the last. It wasn't just the weather. Massive earthquakes split open the ground, swallowing entire buildings. Fires erupted out of nowhere, scorching entire forests and spreading through cities faster than firefighters could respond. The survivors watched as the world they knew seemed to fall apart, piece by piece. But despite the devastation, the group refused to give in. They worked together, helping each other stay alive. The doctors in their group tended to the injured, while the engineers used their skills to build temporary shelters and escape routes. The military officers knew how to protect the group, organizing defense plans against the dangerous elements. Everyone had a role to play, and they worked tirelessly, day after day, trying to survive each new test the aliens threw at them. The aliens weren't just watching. They were observing every move, every decision, and every reaction. They had designed this part of the test to see how humans would respond when pushed to the edge. They wanted to see if people would turn on each other in fear, or if they would come together and fight back. The aliens weren't expecting the humans to win. They were only interested in testing their limits, to see how far they could be pushed before they broke. But the humans, against all odds, began to surprise the aliens. When the sandstorms in Africa reached a peak, the survivors in that region did not run in fear. Instead, they found a way to use the storm to their advantage. Using their knowledge of engineering, they built makeshift wind turbines to generate power from the storm's energy. They turned the sand into a tool for survival, using it to create barriers that shielded them from the worst of the winds. The aliens, watching from afar, were astonished. This was not the reaction they had expected. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, the survivors were finding ways to stay alive in the face of flooding, fires, and earthquakes. They built boats and rafts to escape the rising waters, using the very resources the aliens had thought would destroy them to stay afloat. The survivors in the cities used their knowledge of buildings to create makeshift shelters that could withstand the fires and protect them from falling debris. It was clear now, humanity was not going down without a fight. But as the days passed, the survivors began to realize something even more terrifying. The aliens weren't just testing their physical strength and survival skills. The real test, they began to understand, was psychological. Every challenge, every disaster, every moment of terror was designed to break their will. The aliens wanted to see how much fear humanity could take before they turned on each other. Would they break down and lose hope, or would they keep fighting, no matter the cost? And then, the next challenge arrived. This time, it wasn't just nature that threatened the survivors. It was the aliens themselves. A massive ship appeared in the sky, a vessel so large that it blotted out the sun. The survivors watched in awe as the ship hovered over their cities, sending down waves of energy that disintegrated everything it touched. The aliens were showing their power, just how far they could go if they chose to destroy humanity. The survivors were now faced with a choice. Would they fight back against this new threat, or would they surrender? The aliens were not going to stop the test. They had made it clear that failure meant death, but the survivors knew they couldn't give up. They were already at their lowest, already pushed to the brink. And yet they were still standing. They realized the only way to win was to keep moving forward. They had to fight, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. In every corner of the world, small groups of survivors began to organize. They communicated through hidden networks, sharing information, resources, and plans. The aliens thought they were breaking humanity, but instead, they had sparked something much stronger: unity. Despite the odds, the survivors had found a way to keep going. They had found strength in each other, in their shared will to survive. As the days turned into weeks, the survivors began to adapt. They didn't just survive the disasters. They learned from them. They figured out how to harness the alien technology that had been left behind in the wake of the tests. They scavenged, built, and created new weapons, new ways of fighting back. They refused to be broken. And in doing so, they sent a message to the aliens. The test had only just begun, but humanity was far from defeated. The aliens had underestimated humanity's ability to survive, to adapt, and to fight back. The survivors didn't know if they would win, but they knew one thing for certain. They were going to make the aliens regret ever thinking they could break them. The world was gripped by chaos as the alien challenge began in earnest. For the first few hours, no one fully understood what was happening. There were no signs or warnings, just the sudden, global transmission from the aliens. The message was simple and chilling: survive or perish. The test has begun. As the signal faded, it was replaced by a storm of destruction. In every corner of the earth, something terrible was happening. In Europe, a deadly cold front moved in from the Arctic, freezing entire cities in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, across the Pacific Ocean, an unprecedented series of earthquakes struck, each one more violent than the last, splitting the earth open and swallowing entire communities. Fires erupted across North America as if the planet itself had decided to burn. In Africa, enormous dust storms, miles high, began to obscure the sun, trapping people in an endless, suffocating cloud of sand. At first, there was panic. Governments scrambled to make sense of what was happening. The military launched desperate attempts to combat the natural disasters, but nothing seemed to work. Power grids failed as the storms knocked out electrical systems. People fled their homes in terror, many of them caught in the deadly chaos. It felt like the end of the world. Among the confusion, there was a small group of survivors who refused to let the destruction break them. They were ordinary people: school teachers, engineers, doctors, a few military officers, who had found each other in the midst of the crisis. They were not heroes. They had no special powers, but they shared one thing: a determination to fight back. They had watched their cities crumble, their loved ones fall, but they were not going to give up without a fight. The first challenge was brutal. As the storms raged, people struggled to stay alive. The temperature dropped so low in some parts of the world that the very air seemed to freeze, turning it into ice. In other areas, the earthquakes and wildfires raged uncontrollably. The survivors saw the destruction unfold across every corner of the planet, and they knew that the aliens were watching. The challenges weren't just physical, they were psychological, designed to break humanity's will to survive. The question the aliens wanted answered wasn't just, can you survive? But how much can you endure before you give up? For the survivors, it wasn't about giving up. They had no choice but to keep going. They were used to working together under stress. But this was different. The scale of the destruction was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Entire cities were wiped off the map in a matter of hours. It wasn't just the storms or the earthquakes. It was the overwhelming sense of helplessness. People watched as their world fell apart, and they realized that the aliens were making it clear there was no escape. Despite the impossible odds, the survivors began to organize. They started small. They banded together in groups, using the skills they had to help each other. The doctors tended to the injured and sick. The engineers started working on makeshift shelters that could withstand the brutal storms. The military officers began to set up defenses against the rising chaos. It wasn't much, but it was something. The survivors realized that, despite the overwhelming odds, they were not helpless. They were still humans, and they still had the will to fight. They didn't just survive the storms. They began to learn from them. In Africa, where the sandstorms had been most devastating, the survivors used their knowledge of engineering to build barriers and shelters out of the very sand that had been destroying them. They turned the storms into an opportunity to create wind-powered devices that could provide them with energy. The aliens, watching from their distant ship, had expected humanity to collapse under the pressure. But instead, humans were adapting, using the very disasters designed to break them as tools for survival. In other parts of the world, the survivors were doing the same. In North America, where the fires raged uncontrollably, the survivors started working together to build fire breaks and protective barriers. They had no idea how long the fires would last, but they knew they had to keep moving forward. It wasn't just about surviving the fires. It was about finding a way to keep the flames at bay and protect those around them. Meanwhile, in the cities struck by earthquakes, the survivors used their knowledge of construction and architecture to reinforce buildings and shelters. They created escape routes from collapsed buildings and set up makeshift hospitals to care for the injured. They used every skill they had, every scrap of knowledge they could find, to stay alive. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to change. The aliens had been watching, and they were beginning to get frustrated. The humans weren't breaking. They weren't losing hope. They were working together, and they were starting to adapt to the challenges thrown at them. The aliens had expected humanity to fall apart, but instead, they were witnessing something unexpected: unity. This was the moment when the real test began. The first challenges had been physical. Nature itself had been turned against humanity. But the aliens had been testing more than just the human body. They were testing human minds, testing how much pressure a person could take before cracking. The aliens had been watching closely, waiting to see if humanity's unity would survive when things got truly desperate. The aliens had underestimated one thing: the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the survivors didn't turn on each other. They didn't give in to fear or despair. Instead, they found ways to work together, to build something from the ruins of their broken world. In their darkest hour, they realized that survival wasn't just about individual strength. It was about community, about the strength that comes from working together when everything else is falling apart. The aliens had assumed that their test was unbeatable, but they hadn't accounted for the willpower of a species that had always fought for survival, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The survivors hadn't just survived the storms. They had found a way to thrive in the chaos. They hadn't just faced the physical challenges. They had found a way to resist the psychological manipulation the aliens had planned. And the aliens, for the first time, began to realize that the test they had designed to break humanity might have just made humans stronger. The survivors weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back. They weren't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. The aliens had designed this test to prove their superiority. But in the end, it was the humans who had shown the aliens what true strength really looked like. And as the survivors looked at each other, exhausted but determined, they knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The survivors had learned to adapt, but the aliens weren't done with them yet. If anything, the aliens had been watching with increasing interest as humanity's resilience continued to defy their expectations. The world was still in chaos, but the survivors were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting to win. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a battle of wills. Humanity's collective spirit had been put to the ultimate test, and so far, it had held strong. But the aliens, who had watched countless civilizations crumble under pressure, were about to turn up the heat. The weather-based challenges had been only the beginning. The next stage of the test was far more insidious. It wasn't just nature or the elements they had to fight anymore. It was the very essence of their minds that was now in danger. One day, without warning, the skies darkened, and a strange hum filled the air. People looked up, expecting another storm or earthquake. But what they saw was something entirely different. Massive ships descended from the sky, emitting strange, pulsating lights. They weren't here to just destroy. They were here to manipulate. The first wave of alien ships began to project an eerie, disorienting sound, unlike anything Earth had ever known. The hum invaded people's minds, causing hallucinations, memories to distort, and their deepest fears to manifest in terrifying forms. In the streets, people clutched their heads in agony as they saw loved ones they had lost, the destruction of their homes, and worst of all, the images of themselves failing, broken under the pressure of the test. The survivors immediately recognized the danger. The aliens weren't just testing them physically now. They were testing their mental strength. The world seemed to blur as the line between reality and nightmare disappeared. People couldn't trust what they saw, couldn't even trust their own minds. Fear, anxiety, and despair began to creep into the hearts of many, even the strongest survivors. Would they crack under this new psychological assault? But the group that had formed in the earlier chaos, the survivors who had found strength in each other, had a different reaction. They didn't collapse in fear. Instead, they came together, refusing to let the aliens break them with their tricks. They knew this was the next step of the test, and they would not be manipulated. They understood now that if they gave in to fear, they would lose not just the fight, but their humanity. And that was something they would not allow. With their minds clear, they began to plan. The strange ships hovering in the sky were part of the test, no doubt, but they could not let the fear take control. The engineers in the group quickly got to work, devising a way to block the alien signals. They used every resource they could find, scraps of technology, parts from old communication devices, and even some of the alien tech that had been left behind in earlier parts of the test. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Slowly, the survivors began to find a way to shut down the alien hums in their immediate surroundings, allowing them to think clearly once more. This was the moment when they realized just how much they had learned. In the beginning, they were nothing more than a few scattered survivors trying to stay alive in an unforgiving world. But now they had become a unit, a team that could think, adapt, and fight together in ways the aliens hadn't predicted. Their response to this new challenge wasn't to panic or run. It was to fight back with everything they had. While some groups were still struggling to break free of the mental manipulation, the survivors who had banded together were making progress. They knew that they had to stay united. They had learned that when faced with a challenge, they needed to use every tool at their disposal, even if the tools were rudimentary. They started to communicate with other survivor groups, sharing what they had learned about the alien ships and how to block the disturbing sounds. It wasn't an easy task, and it didn't stop the hallucinations completely, but it gave them a fighting chance. Together, they began to build a network, a resistance. However, even as they fought back, the aliens were not giving up. They sent down even more ships, this time emitting pulses of energy that interfered with the survivors' makeshift defenses. The aliens had learned from the previous failures. They were adjusting their tactics, becoming more ruthless in their attempt to break humanity's resolve. This wasn't just about proving their superiority anymore. It was about wiping humanity off the map entirely. But despite the obstacles, the survivors found strength in each other. They had already overcome so much. The early challenges had taught them how to survive, how to adapt to the world's destruction. Now, the mental games were the next hurdle, and they would not be defeated by that either. Days turned into weeks, and the attacks from the aliens only grew more intense. But something strange began to happen. The survivors who had been working together started to find ways to turn the tables. They realized that the aliens were monitoring everything they did, watching them from afar, studying their reactions. The more they adapted, the more they learned about the aliens' patterns. The survivors weren't just surviving anymore. They were outsmarting the aliens. They used their growing knowledge to create countermeasures to the alien attacks. They crafted signals that interfered with the alien frequencies, sending waves of disorienting feedback that scrambled the aliens' communication systems. They developed traps using their understanding of alien technology, trying to capture one of the ships and learn from it. The aliens, once so confident that their test was unbeatable, were starting to feel the pressure. The survivors had gone from simply enduring the impossible to actively fighting back. The aliens hadn't anticipated this. They thought the psychological tactics would break humanity's spirit. They were wrong. The more the survivors fought back, the more they realized that the aliens had underestimated them. Yes, the challenges were deadly. Yes, the disasters were overwhelming. But humanity had one advantage the aliens hadn't accounted for: the ability to adapt, to change, and to fight through impossible odds. The survivors weren't just trying to pass the test anymore. They were trying to win. They were sending a message to the aliens: we will not be broken. And as they prepared for the next wave of challenges, they knew they were ready. They had passed the first test. They had survived the storms. They had fought back against the mental manipulations. Now they were going to show the aliens that humanity was not a species to be underestimated. They were going to make the aliens regret ever thinking they could crush Earth. This battle was far from over, but the survivors were no longer just reacting to the test. They were turning the tide. And as they looked up at the skies, they knew one thing: humanity wasn't just surviving anymore. They were about to show the aliens exactly what they were capable of. The survivors had finally reached the edge of what they believed was possible. With each challenge, they had endured, adapted, and fought back harder than anyone had ever thought they could. But the aliens were relentless. They weren't simply testing humanity's physical strength or resilience anymore. They were preparing for something far more sinister. The challenges that had once seemed like natural disasters were no longer random. They were deliberate and calculated, crafted to push humanity into submission. Now, the stakes had escalated. The aliens were shifting their tactics, and this time, they were taking their psychological manipulation to a whole new level. The ships that had been circling Earth began emitting strange, disorienting signals that affected the very structure of time and space around them. Reality itself started to bend in unnatural ways. It began with small, unexplainable occurrences. People would walk into a room and forget why they had entered, only to find themselves in a completely different place than they had been moments before. In some cities, entire buildings seemed to warp, their foundations shifting without warning, creating labyrinths of corridors that led to nowhere. Survivors reported seeing alternate versions of themselves, others that had made different choices or had survived events that, in their world, had never happened. The fabric of reality itself seemed to unravel, And as the survivors struggled to understand what was happening, it became clear this was no accident. The aliens had perfected their mind games. This new wave of challenges wasn't about controlling the survivors physically. It was about breaking them mentally. They wanted to destroy the very core of what made humanity human, the ability to think, to make decisions, to trust what one saw and experienced. The survivors had already faced storms, fires, and earthquakes. They had battled psychological manipulation, fought back against hallucinations and nightmares, and managed to stay united. But this was different. This wasn't just physical destruction or even mental confusion. It was a direct assault on their perception of reality. At first, the group felt lost. No matter where they turned, they seemed to be walking in circles. Time itself seemed to stretch and contract, with hours feeling like days and minutes feeling like seconds. The cities they had once known, the places they had fought to protect, were now twisted versions of themselves. People they thought were dead appeared to be alive, and people who had survived the worst were now nowhere to be found. But amid this confusion, the group's leadership began to crystallize once again. It was the same people who had come together in the very beginning of the test, those who had seen the storms, earthquakes, and fires, and had fought back. They knew that if they were to overcome this latest challenge, they had to do something the aliens hadn't counted on. They had to trust each other, and they had to trust their own instincts. As they wandered through the disorienting world, the survivors started to notice patterns. Despite the bending of time and reality, there were places, small pockets in the world, where things seemed normal, almost like safe zones. These safe zones, they realized, were key. They weren't a product of the aliens' mind games, but rather a way to fight back against them. Whenever they reached these pockets, they could think clearly again, even if only for a few moments. It was in these zones that they began to figure out how to escape the chaos. One by one, the survivors gathered their courage, and with the help of their remaining technology, remnants of alien equipment they had scavenged before, they managed to create a device that could temporarily stabilize the fabric of space and time around them. It wasn't perfect, and the aliens knew they were trying to fight back, but it was enough. Enough to give them hope. And in this new stage of their fight, hope became their most powerful weapon. The device they had crafted allowed them to create small zones of stability, places where reality itself could be temporarily anchored. The survivors set up these zones in key locations, places where the alien manipulations were at their strongest. It was in these places that they began to plan their next moves, and most importantly, to fight back with everything they had left. They had no illusions about the aliens' power, but they had learned something important through their struggles. They were not powerless. They were not victims. They had learned how to adapt, to survive, and to push back. Now they would use the very thing the aliens had underestimated against them: their ability to think, to reason, to unite in the face of overwhelming odds. The survivors weren't just surviving anymore. They had evolved into something greater than themselves. They had become a resistance, a force that could stand against even the most devastating of alien manipulations. Each group worked tirelessly, strategizing, fighting, and reinforcing the zones of stability that kept them grounded. They were relentless in their quest to reclaim their world, to show the aliens that their species would not break, no matter the cost. But the aliens, despite being impressed by humanity's resilience, were not ready to surrender. They were determined to prove that they were superior, that they could crush humanity's spirit, and that the test would not fail. A final confrontation seemed inevitable. As the survivors grew bolder in their efforts, the aliens responded by sending their forces into these newly stabilized zones. Giant ships hovered above, casting shadows over the battle-torn landscapes, their weapons charged and ready to fire. The survivors knew that this would be the ultimate test. If they could defend their last strongholds, if they could hold their ground against the alien onslaught, they might stand a chance of proving that humanity was not just capable of surviving, but capable of victory. The next few days were a blur of movement, strategy, and conflict. The survivors, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, fought with everything they had. They used the knowledge they had gained over the course of the test, the alien technology, the tricks they had learned, the strategies they had perfected, to create one final desperate stand. The skies above crackled with energy as the alien ships launched their attack. The survivors, fueled by the will to protect their homes, their loved ones, and their future, launched their own counterattack. The air was thick with tension as both sides clashed in the ultimate battle for survival. For the first time, it became clear to the aliens that humanity had passed their test, not through strength alone, but through unity, resilience, and the sheer will to survive. They had underestimated humanity's ability to fight back, to learn, and to grow. As the battle reached its peak, the survivors, with a combination of tactics and sheer determination, began to gain the upper hand. The alien ships, damaged by the clever tactics of the humans, began to retreat. It wasn't just a victory over the aliens. It was proof that humanity had the strength, the heart, and the mind to win. The aliens had designed this test to destroy humanity, but instead they had awakened a force that was far more powerful than they could ever have imagined. The survivors had won, not because they had defeated the aliens, but because they had proven that no matter how many tests, how much destruction, how much manipulation they faced, humanity could never be broken. And in the end, that was a victory that no alien force could ever take away. The survivors stood on the brink of victory, but the battle wasn't over. The aliens, though retreating, were not done. They had underestimated humanity's resilience, but that didn't mean they would give up without a final push. In the wake of the intense battle, the survivors began to gather their strength, preparing for whatever the aliens might throw at them next. They had learned to trust each other, to use their collective knowledge and resources, but the final phase of the test was still unfolding. After the battle, the skies above Earth grew eerily silent. For a few precious moments, the survivors could almost believe they had won. But they knew better. The aliens didn't retreat easily. They had their own tricks, their own weapons, and their own methods. The survivors couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. The final challenge was upon them, and it would test every ounce of their will. The survivors gathered in their makeshift command center, a large building that had survived the alien bombardment, located in one of the few remaining stable zones. The team was small but united. Doctors, engineers, military officers, and civilians. Every one of them had become an invaluable part of the resistance. As they looked out across the desolate landscape, they knew that this quiet wasn't peace. It was the calm before the storm. Then, without warning, the sky flickered. The very air around them seemed to shimmer. A vast fleet of alien ships appeared in the distance, their enormous, dark silhouettes blocking out the sun. But this time, the aliens were not attacking. They were waiting. It was as if the aliens had learned from their previous mistakes, and now they were watching, observing, as if they were testing humanity one final time. At the head of the survivors, a sense of dread settled in. This wasn't just a test of survival anymore. It was a test of trust, of faith. The aliens wanted to see if humanity could hold on to its hope and unity, even when the very fabric of existence seemed to tear at the edges. They had pushed humanity to its limits, physically, mentally, emotionally. And now, they were pushing again. But this time, it wasn't about defeating the humans physically. It was about breaking their spirit. The survivors had no choice but to face this final test head-on. They had already proven themselves to be resilient, adaptable, and capable of surviving impossible odds. But now, the real question was whether they could continue to stand united, despite everything that had been taken from them. As the alien ships descended lower, the survivors made a decision. They weren't going to let fear dictate their actions. They had come this far not because they were lucky, but because they had refused to give up. They had fought the storms. The earthquakes, the fires, and the alien manipulations. They had faced down the darkness and emerged stronger. They could do this. They would not let the aliens take their will. The survivors began organizing one final push. They would strike at the heart of the alien operation, taking everything they had learned over the last few months and using it against the invaders. They knew they had no time to waste. Every minute counted. The world may have been on the brink of annihilation, but as long as they breathed, they were still in the fight. The key to the final plan lay in the alien technology they had salvaged and adapted over time. They had learned how to hack into the alien communication systems, how to manipulate their equipment, and how to use their own technology against them. The survivors knew that if they could get close enough to the main alien vessel, they could disable it, breaking the final link in the aliens' hold on Earth. As they prepared to move out, the group paused for a moment. There was a quiet understanding between them, a moment of solidarity. They had faced the impossible before, and now they would face it once again. This time, however, they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to take back their future, to reclaim their world. The final battle was nothing like what anyone had expected. The alien ships did not engage with immediate violence. Instead, they unleashed waves of energy that distorted reality itself. The survivors, using the devices they had crafted, fought back by creating pockets of stability, keeping their minds clear even as the very ground beneath them shook. The sky above them cracked with unnatural light. But this time, the aliens weren't trying to destroy them outright. They were trying to break their resolve, to drive them into madness. The survivors pressed forward, their movements synchronized, their determination unshakable. They had come to understand something vital. This test was not about brute strength or even intelligence. It was about perseverance. It was about the power to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, even when it seemed like there was no hope left. And they had that strength in abundance. The last moments of the battle were filled with a fierce, collective energy. The survivors, working as a unified force, breached the heart of the alien command ship. Inside, they confronted the alien overlord, who had orchestrated the entire test. The being was unlike anything humanity had ever seen, its form shifting and alien, its presence overwhelming. But despite its terrifying power, it was clear that the alien was not prepared for the unity and strength that the humans now embodied. As they confronted the alien overlord, the survivors delivered their final message. They would not be broken. They would not be controlled. This world, their world, was not for the taking. They had fought for it, and they would continue to fight for it. In the final moments, the alien overlord hesitated. The test had been designed to break them, to prove the superiority of the invaders. But the humans had proven something far greater than survival. They had proven that their spirit, their will, could not be destroyed. The overlord, witnessing humanity's strength firsthand, made a choice. It retreated, taking its forces with it, leaving Earth behind. The survivors stood in the aftermath of the final confrontation, their hearts still pounding from the intensity of the battle. The sky cleared, the alien ships disappeared, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the Earth was quiet. They had done it. Against all odds, they had prevailed. The test was over, and humanity had passed. The survivors looked around at the world they had fought to protect. It was scared, broken in places, but it was still theirs. They had won not just by surviving, but by showing that no force, no matter how powerful, could ever truly conquer the will of humanity. They had faced the impossible and had emerged stronger, united in their belief that as long as they stood together, there was no challenge they could not overcome. And as they walked away from the battlefield, they knew one thing for certain. The future of Earth was no longer in the hands of the aliens. It was in theirs, and they would rebuild stronger than ever before. They had faced the ultimate test, and they had won.